History was written on the pitch. But only a few hours later, that history was overshadowed by a tragedy no one had expected. After 40 years of waiting, Mexico finally won a World Cup knockout match on home soil. Millions of people poured into the streets to celebrate, turning Mexico City into a sea of flags, lights, and cheers. But just as the joy was reaching its peak, the scene suddenly descended into chaos. Within only a few minutes, 4 people had died. What really happened in the middle of that massive crowd? Why do many people believe this was not just an accident, but a disaster that could have been completely prevented? And why did FIFA become the name facing the harshest criticism after the incident? Let us look back at the full sequence of events to find the answer. To understand why millions of Mexicans poured into the streets that night, we need to go back to the match that had just ended at Azteca Stadium. It was more than just a victory. For Mexican fans, it felt like the release of 4 decades of frustration. Since the 1986 World Cup, the national team had always been eliminated in the knockout stage, leaving generations of supporters heartbroken. Every World Cup brought renewed hope, only to end in disappointment. But this time, everything was different. Against Ecuador, Mexico played with confidence and composure. Crisp passing, relentless determination, and outstanding performances from several young players helped the host nation secure a convincing 2-0 victory, officially booking their place in the round of 16. The moment the final whistle blew, tens of thousands of fans inside Azteca Stadium erupted with emotion. Across the country's major cities, especially in Mexico City, people flooded the streets carrying flags, wearing team jerseys, and singing familiar chants. After so many years of waiting, they believed they were witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in Mexican football. But no one could have imagined that only a few minutes later, that festive atmosphere would take a completely different turn. Immediately after the match ended, crowds from Azteca Stadium and other parts of the city began making their way toward Paseo de la Reforma, the famous central boulevard in Mexico City, home to the Angel of Independence Monument. For decades, this had been the traditional gathering place whenever the national team celebrated a major victory, and that night was no exception. According to estimates from local authorities, more than 1 million people gathered in the area to celebrate. Mexican flags covered the streets, car horns echoed without pause, while flares, music, and chants created an atmosphere of extraordinary excitement. For many, it was a moment they had been waiting for over decades. But as the crowd continued to grow, the space available for each person began to disappear. Roads that were normally wide were quickly packed to capacity. Many people at the back kept moving forward, unaware that there was almost no room left ahead. In a crowd that dense, even a small disturbance was enough to trigger a chain reaction. Some eyewitnesses said the panic began after fireworks exploded in the middle of the crowd. People started pushing and shoving, desperately trying to find a way through. Within just a few minutes, the cheers gave way to screams, cries for help, and urgent emergency calls. By the time medical teams reached the scene, many people had already lost consciousness from a lack of oxygen, and paramedics were forced to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation directly on the pavement. That was the moment when a night of football celebration officially turned into a tragedy. What is especially notable is that, according to the initial information, most of the victims did not die from being trampled, as many people might assume. The main cause was identified as suffocation caused by compression inside the crowd. This is a phenomenon that safety experts call crowd crush, one of the most dangerous risks at mass gatherings. When crowd density exceeds a safe level, each person almost completely loses the ability to move independently. The pressure no longer comes from just a few people pushing from behind, but from thousands of people generating a massive force in every direction. At that point, the chest no longer has enough space to expand, causing victims to gradually run out of oxygen and possibly lose consciousness within only a few minutes. What makes it terrifying is that many people remain standing throughout the process. They do not necessarily fall immediately, yet they cannot breathe or move. Once just one person loses balance, the domino effect can spread very quickly, pulling many others into it and creating a chaotic spiral that is almost impossible to control. That is also why experts always emphasize that a crowd disaster does not begin when people panic. It begins the moment crowd density exceeds the safe limit. Once that happens, even a small spark, such as the sound of fireworks, a rumor, or a sudden shift in the direction of the crowd, can turn a celebration into a tragedy in an instant. And that is what led to the biggest question after the incident. If this risk had already been known in advance, why was it still not prevented? Immediately after the incident, a major debate erupted across the media and social platforms. Many people began asking the same question: who should be held responsible for this tragedy? Was it FIFA, the World Cup organizing committee, the city authorities, or was it simply the consequence of an overwhelmingly large crowd? First, it is important to recognize that millions of people pouring into the streets to celebrate a historic victory was entirely predictable. Mexico is a country with an extraordinary passion for football, and a victory after 40 years of waiting was always likely to bring massive public celebrations. In other words, this was not an unexpected situation. According to information from the Mexico City authorities, preventive measures had already been put in place. The city deployed additional security personnel, installed more public viewing screens to spread out the crowds, and even urged residents not to gather in excessive numbers around the Angel of Independence monument. That suggests the authorities were aware of the potential risks. However, those measures ultimately appeared insufficient for the sheer scale of the crowds that poured into the city center. Meanwhile, FIFA also became the target of widespread criticism across social media. Although the incident occurred outside the stadium and was not under FIFA's direct control, many argued that a tournament of this global scale should involve closer coordination with the host nation in forecasting and managing public celebration areas. However, as of now, there has been no official conclusion determining that FIFA bears legal responsibility for the tragedy. For that reason, rather than rushing to place the blame on a single individual or organization, perhaps the more important question is this: was the entire safety system for an event involving millions of people truly prepared for a gathering of this magnitude? The answer to that question may only become clear once the official investigation has been completed. What makes this incident especially thought-provoking is not only the number of casualties, but also one undeniable fact: the risk had already been recognized before the match even began. Throughout the weeks of the World Cup, every victory by the Mexican national team brought increasingly larger celebrations to the heart of the capital. City officials were well aware of that pattern. They introduced a number of preventive measures, including opening additional public viewing areas, installing more LED screens to spread out the crowds, increasing the number of security personnel, and even restricting the sale of alcoholic beverages on match days. Before the match against Ecuador, the authorities also publicly advised people not to gather in excessive numbers around the Angel of Independence monument because the area was already approaching its safe capacity. That makes one thing clear: the risk was never ignored. The real issue is that the measures put in place appeared to be insufficient for the actual scale of the crowds that arrived after the historic victory. This is also a challenge that many countries hosting major sporting events have faced. A disaster does not always begin with one catastrophic mistake. Sometimes, it is the result of multiple small failures happening at the same time: inaccurate forecasting, insufficient crowd management personnel, overwhelmed exit routes, or a crowd growing far beyond every projection. That is why this investigation is about far more than identifying the immediate cause of the 4 deaths. More importantly, it must answer the question that millions of people are now asking: if the warning signs had already appeared in advance, why was there no plan effective enough to prevent the tragedy? And could the same thing happen again as Mexico continues its World Cup campaign in the next round? Sadly, this is not the first time the world has witnessed a tragedy unfold in the middle of a massive celebration or a large public gathering. Over the years, there have been numerous incidents that have left behind painful lessons about crowd management. In 1989, the Hillsborough disaster in England claimed the lives of 97 people when thousands of football supporters were forced into an already overcrowded section of the stadium. At first, many believed the chaos had been caused by the fans themselves. But after years of investigation, the final conclusion showed that failures in event organization and crowd control were the factors that led to the tragedy. A more recent example is the crowd crush in Itaewon, South Korea, in 2022, which claimed the lives of more than 150 people. There was no fire, no terrorist attack, and no natural disaster. Tens of thousands of people simply converged on an area that was far too narrow, creating overwhelming pressure that quickly spiraled beyond anyone's control. What these disasters have in common is that they all began during moments that seemed completely ordinary. No one went there expecting to be in danger. People simply wanted to enjoy an event, celebrate with friends, or share a joyful moment with their community. But once crowd density exceeds a safe limit, even a single small trigger can lead to irreversible consequences. That is why safety experts consistently emphasize that crowd management is not about reacting after an incident has already happened. It is about preventing that incident from happening in the first place. And that may be the greatest lesson Mexico and the World Cup organizers will have to confront in the aftermath of this heartbreaking event. Although the investigation is still underway, the World Cup waits for no one. Just a few days after the tragedy, Mexico will return to the pitch for its round of 16 match against England. That also means, if the host nation wins again, another massive wave of celebrations is almost certain to follow. But this time, nothing will be the same. The authorities in Mexico City are now under intense public pressure. They must not only determine what led to the deaths of 4 people, but also prove that the new safety measures will be strong enough to prevent a similar tragedy from happening again. Because if another incident occurs, the consequences will extend far beyond the number of casualties. It would also deal a serious blow to the reputation of the host nation and the tournament as a whole. This is also a major test for FIFA and the World Cup organizers. While the question of legal responsibility will have to await the outcome of the official investigation, the expectations of football fans around the world have already changed. They no longer expect only thrilling matches on the pitch. They also expect events outside the stadium to be managed with the same level of care and safety as the matches themselves. Perhaps after that fateful night, the greatest challenge facing the World Cup is no longer how to stage the most spectacular celebration, but how to ensure that millions of people can experience the joy of the tournament and still return home safely. The World Cup is always remembered for beautiful goals, dramatic comebacks, and historic moments. But sometimes, what makes the whole world stop is not the result on the scoreboard, but what happens after the final whistle. Mexico's victory should have become one of the most beautiful memories for generations of fans. Yet within only a few minutes, that joy was overshadowed by a tragedy that left 4 families forever unable to reunite with their loved ones. Until the official investigation is concluded, many questions remain unanswered. Who should be held responsible? How far were the earlier warnings actually acted upon? And most importantly, will the lessons from this incident be enough to prevent similar tragedies in the future? Football has always brought powerful emotions, but it can only feel truly complete when people are able to celebrate together and return home safely. Hopefully, this loss will become a reason for major tournaments around the world to take fan safety more seriously, so that no victory ever has to end in tears again.